I'm going to be talking about my latest novel, Harvest. It's a book which is set in the English landscape, sometime in the English historical past. I don't specify where exactly. But as you can tell by its title, Harvest, its applications and its resonances are worldwide. For humankind anywhere in the world to survive, humankind which is settled, farming humankind, everybody needs to have a harvest. Everybody needs to have food to eat. And so the whole idea of harvest is so important to every community in the world. In the specific instance of my book, this current novel, which is called Harvest, the idea came in the English Midlands. I live in Birmingham, which I'm sure a lot of people in Chennai and India will know is a very multicultural part of the United Kingdom, full of Indian immigrants and Pakistani immigrants, West Indians. But nevertheless, the landscape around it, which we call Shakespeare country, is full of history and is full of agriculture. And one of the specific things about that landscape that anyone walking in it will see is that there is evidence that in the 15th century, 16th century, 17th century, those lands were stolen and seized by landowners from the farmers in order to raise sheep. It was seen that sheep could make huge profits by selling wool and meat, much bigger profits than allowing the farmers to grow crops. And so when those lands were seized, they were not ploughed anymore. And the plough marks, which were made in, say, 1560 or 1660, those plough marks can still be seen in the fields of England. They're called ridge and furrow because they're made of a ridge and a furrow. Now they're beautiful. And when you stand in the middle of the field and see these ridges and furrows, you are bound to think how beautiful the landscape is and how rich the landscape is. But what occurred to me before I wrote this book was that these signs of a beautiful landscape, these etchings of history into the fields of England, not only were beautiful, they were also the record of a dispossession, of a political cruelty. So the idea of the mix of a beautiful landscape and a political dispossession, a dispossession of people from their lands, struck me as being a very important subject to write about. On the day that I decided that I wanted to write this novel, Harvest, I'd made my mind up that it would be set sometime in English history. It would be about ridge and furrow fields. I picked up a newspaper in England, the Guardian newspaper, and there in the overseas section was a story about the seizure of land in Brazil by soya barons, people who wanted to grow soya beans. And there was exactly the story that I'd imagined in 2012 in the newspaper. It wasn't happening to English farmers, it was happening to Brazilian farmers. What this told me was that somewhere in the world, every day, people are being robbed of their land so that some landowner can make money out of them and make profit out of the landscape. And that is the subject of my book. It seems like an historical novel set in England. Actually, it's a political novel set in the world. What happens in Harvest is that, as is to be expected in any community which is under threat, things fall apart. Now, in my home city of Birmingham, I'm not complacent about these things, but in my home city of Birmingham, I would say we are a very hospitable people, and the multiculturalism in Birmingham works very, very well. Communities rub shoulders, get on extremely well. I have Pakistani neighbours and West Indian neighbours, no problem at all. But everybody knows that anywhere in the world, it doesn't have to be England or Europe, anywhere in the world, when people start running out of money, or their health is imperiled, or there's no jobs, or there's no housing, it's at moments like that that you start to pick on your neighbours and you start to distrust people who are different from you, different race, different colour, different sexual orientation. So what happens in this book is that at the time that the fields are being seized by the farmer, everybody starts to distrust their neighbours, and particularly they distrust the incomers, the people who are refugees and coming to the city. So really what happens in this book is that over a period of 7 days, a tranquil community which gets on very well because it is successful turns into a hateful and Now that sounds very, very pessimistic, but I'm not a pessimist, I'm an optimist. But optimism is useless unless it looks into the dark corners of humankind, unless it recognizes that there are pressures on the way that we live our lives. So this is an optimistic book about the 7-day disintegration of a small English community, which actually, I hope, at the end of the book, persuades readers that if we recognize the problems in the world, we can beat them. Because the title of the book, Harvest, plays a part in the novel because the week of the novel is the harvest week. The barley that they've been growing, the barley which is going to be used as animal feed or to make beer, for example, and to make bread, the barley is being brought in. But because they know that after thousands of years of farming this same piece of land, with your father, your grandfather, your great-grandfather ploughing the fields in the same way that you are ploughing them, everybody knows this is going to be the last harvest ever, that ground will never grow barley again, that land is about to be taken away. So that is the concentration of the book. Harvest week in July, August, in one summer in England sometime in the past. Yes, it's a very interesting question about a protagonist, because when you decide, are you going to tell your story in a first person using I, or are you going to tell the story in the third person using he or she? And it's very, very different. It's such an important decision, and it's a decision you have to get right before you start writing your book. If I had decided to describe it as he and she, I could be me, the writer. I could be a godlike narrator, and I would know everything. I would be able to be like a big eagle hovering above the ground, seeing everything and knowing everything. But what I wanted something more intimate. I wanted something more on the ground level. I wanted something more from the community. And so I decided that I would forget my own personal voice and tell the story in the first person voice of a man called Walter Thirsk. And he's an incomer. He's a man that's come to the village about 20 or 30 years ago. He's well known, he marries a local woman, he's completely trusted. You would think he was safe. But because people have become suspicious and fearful, they even start to mistrust Walter Thirsk. And so this man, Walter, tells the story. When the book opens at the beginning of the story week, he's comfortable and he's trusted and he's well regarded. By the end of the week, he's fleeing for his life. So that's the person who tells the story, Walter. The story ends almost where it begins, at the bounds of the village. My book never leaves the village. The landscape is only what the village can offer. The book never goes beyond the hills that you can see in the distance. It never puts a foot beyond the horizons. The idea was to be honest to most agricultural communities in the past, that they're not traveling around the world in fast cars or aeroplanes. They don't see the rest of the world. They're not intimate and knowledgeable about the rest of the world, but they really know their own patch of ground. They are really intimate with every blade of grass that's growing in their fields. And so the book adheres to that idea of claustrophobia, that people's horizons in history were very narrow. I'm sure it's the same in India. Back in the 200 years ago, I'm sure that Indian field workers wouldn't go very far beyond their own village. And so the book ends at the moment that he is about to step beyond the village boundaries and enter the great big world. And that's the shape of the book. Yes, everybody is dispossessed in this book. Everybody except the master, everybody except the landowner. The ruling classes, and I'm sorry to sound like a Marxist, but I'm a bit of a Marxist, or I was anyway. The ruling class holds the reins, they hold the controls. And it's not a sentimental view or an exaggerated view to say that if a poor man decides he wants to change the world, or a poor woman says she wants to change the world, it will be almost impossible. But if a rich man or woman say they want to change the world, then it's relatively easy. And that's one of the lessons that this book tells. Now, Walter is not a rich man, so he becomes dispossessed. It's only the people who are already powerful and are already rich that end up at the end of the book with more power and more wealth. No, of course not. There are many interpretations of wealth that we ought to recognize. And I'm going to sound rather pious now, but Would you rather be a person with a wealth of goods or a wealth of happiness? Would you rather be a person with a wealth of power or a wealth of friends? Well, of course, anyone who's intelligent and sensible will choose happiness and friends over power and richness. However, we can't avoid the fact that being rich, money will not make you happy, but being poor and destitute can make you unhappy. And so this is an important issue. Yeah, there are different kinds of wealth, and we must acknowledge that. And the wealth of money will not put you into paradise, but a lack of money could well put you into hell.